has brown hair, but the other two have blonde, because blonde is recessive, it's just less melanin. My high school biology teacher, her family was like this. She and her husband had dark hair. They had a kid with blonde hair, and people would go, oh, we know how that happened. And the husband would go, yeah, I admit it, I was fooling around. Huntington's disease is a dominant disorder. So somebody would only get it if their parent had it. Unfortunately, it doesn't show any symptoms until about 40 or even 50 years old. So you have no way of knowing whether you have it unless one of your parents had it or you otherwise decide to get tested for it. So it typically gets passed on before someone knows they have it. There are some types of polycystic kidney disease that are dominant, although those most often turn up as those are one thing that's likely to turn up as a new mutation rather than you inherited it. Some recessive examples. Cystic fibrosis is a recessive disorder. We'll take a closer look at cystic fibrosis a little later because even though the textbook covers it here, it also relates to another concept that's coming up. So I want to discuss it there as well. Most metabolic disorders, like I think there's 6 that they test newborns for in Indiana, they are recessive because there's an enzyme that, if you're heterozygous, you at least make some of the functional enzyme. So only if you are homozygous recessive do you have only the bad copy of the enzyme, and you can't do the one thing in metabolism that most of us do. An example of this is phenylketonuria. What happens here is there's one amino acid called phenylalanine that most of us, if there's extra, we transform it into a different amino acid. With phenylketonuria, or PKU, they don't have the enzyme that does that, and the phenylalanine builds up. It's found in the urine, which is why it's called urea, but the buildup can cause brain damage and other disorders. And that's why we test for it right away, because if you know somebody has it, you just have to control their diet so they have less phenylalanine, and you can prevent the damage. Color blindness is an example of an X-linked recessive trait. It codes for the cones in the eye. These are some examples of the tests used. Some of them are easier to see than others. And we just did this in A&P 1. We have the book, and they specify in the handout that goes with it that if you didn't get these from us, there's no guarantee of their quality. We're very careful about printing the exact right colors and the exact right intensity. So when it's up on a screen like this, some of you might be going, I can't read that, and that's just because it's kind of washed out. The cones that detect either red or green, both of those are on the X chromosome. So a male only has one chance of getting functional red and green cones, where a female has 2 chances. And that's why color blindness is so much more common in males. Questions on dominant and recessive examples?
Are males always colorblind from birth, or?
Yeah, it would be from birth. Often you don't notice it because, until if it comes up in conversation of, well, what do you mean those are different colors or something like that, you don't know that they can't tell the difference. And there's also a range of how bad it is and it's how non-functional the cone is. Some people, red and green just both look brown, but I knew a guy who said traffic lights are orange, yellow, and white. So he can see a little bit of difference, but not enough to actually distinguish red from orange and green from white. Probability. This is an important factor in genetics. What are the chances of an offspring getting a particular allele or a particular genotype or a particular phenotype? You can look at each of those. Looking at just one parent at a time, if the parent is heterozygous, then all offspring have a 50% chance of getting each allele. Now, if I have a dimple allele and a non-dimple allele, when my oogenesis goes through, each egg has a 50% chance of having this one, and the other 50% of having this one. If you are homozygous for a particular gene, then every offspring is going to get that allele because you only have one version of it. When we include both parents, it gets more complex, and we have tools for laying it out and figuring it out. The Punnet square is the big one. This shows the probability of each allele combination for each offspring. You would take, if you're looking at one gene at a time, you would put the mother's alleles on top, and we'll just go with they're both heterozygous. The father's alleles down the side. So each sperm could have either of those. Each egg could have either of these, and they can come together in any combination. So in the boxes, you fill in that combination. If there's a dominant allele, you always write that first, no matter which parent it came from. And so if we're looking at just the genotypes, from 2 heterozygous parents, out of 4 we have a 1 in 4 chance of getting heterozygous recessive. A 1 in 4 chance of getting, homozygous recessive. 1 in 4 of getting homozygous dominant. 2 in 4 or 1 in 2 of getting heterozygous. Now if we go to the phenotype, which of these would have the recessive phenotype? Yeah, only the homozygous recessive. And so for the phenotype, it's 3 in 4 of having the dominant phenotype, 1 in 4 of having the recessive phenotype. So this is something that can be used for family planning. Say both parents had somebody in their family with cystic fibrosis. So they want to get tested, find out if they're carriers for it. And then every one of their offspring has a 1 in 4 chance of having cystic fibrosis. Now, I've heard of a case where somebody said, oh, we had 1 kid with cystic fibrosis, so now we can have 3 more and they'll be fine. Doesn't work that way. You roll the dice each time. And they could really hit bad luck and have 4 kids that all have cystic fibrosis. It's 25% chance for each offspring. So in the lab and the focus activity, we're going to do some Punnet squares. Hitting this too hard. Another thing that we use is called a pedigree. This traces the inheritance in a family. The Roman numerals here are for generations. We use squares for male, circles for female. And then if it's divided in half like that, they're heterozygous. If it's solid, then they're homozygous for that form. Then the lines indicate these are the 2 whose gametes combined, and this takes down to the offspring. Pedigrees can be used to help us figure out a pattern. We wouldn't necessarily know if someone is heterozygous. We would just know that they have the dominant phenotype. But we can look at how something was passed and figure out if they were. For example, We know Joe and Mary both have this dominant phenotype, and because one of their children came out with the recessive phenotype, we know they must both be heterozygous to have passed in that allele. Questions on pedigrees? Now, there are some cases where it's not quite that simple. Our book calls this dominance variations. There's something called incomplete dominance, where the heterozygous genotype isn't purely the dominant phenotype, they're somewhere in between. And then there's codominance, where you have both phenotypes. To understand how that's different, so let's say there was a gene for flower color, and the dominant is red and the recessive is white. The heterozygous is pink, that's in between red and white. An example of codominance is the ABO blood group. O is recessive, it means not having A or B. A and B are codominant. So if somebody is A and A or A and O, they're type A. If they're B and B or B and O, then they're type B. Only OO is type O. But if you got an A and a B, then what's your type? Yeah, type AB. So instead of one of them overriding the other, you are putting both antigens on your red blood cells. So with the flower example, codominance, they would be red and white instead of in between, which is pink. So this flower ends up striped. Questions on incomplete and codominance? All right, we at a point where we need a break? No? Okay. All right. Now, to add another layer to it, genotype expression is, are you guaranteed to get that genotype if you have that allele? Penetrance is what percent chance is it that if you have this allele, you will have this trait? So is the gene all or nothing? You either have it or don't. Even if it is completely penetrant, which means 100% will have it, expressivity is variability in how extreme is the phenotype. Is it just a little bit, or is it really obvious? And I'll have an example coming up. A separate feature is pleiotropy, which means one gene affects multiple traits, say a protein that's used in several different systems. So penetrance is the percentage that if you have this gene, you will have this phenotype. So completely penetrant, 100%. Everybody who gets this allele gets this phenotype. Anything less than that is called incompletely penetrant. And almost all genes are actually incompletely penetrant. And that's a feature of just how powerful is this protein in making a difference to how the body works or even how it's structured. Polydactyly is an example that applies to both penetrance and expressivity. So, polydactyly means having extra fingers or toes. So, incomplete penetrance, this is a dominant trait, but you can have a parent with it and pass it on to your child without actually expressing it yourself. And the expressivity is variable. This is a fairly extreme example where this person has an extra digit on all 4 limbs. They've got a 6th toe that's just as large as the others. They've got 6 fingers on both, which looks like they have nails, although they're very short. A lesser expressivity could mean they just have 1 extra toe on 1 foot, and that's it. Questions on penetrance and expressivity? Pleiotropy is for proteins that have multiple uses, so they affect multiple traits. Marfan syndrome is the example given in the textbook. I've used a picture of Abraham Lincoln because appearance-wise he fits the traits of Marfan syndrome. We don't know if internally he would have had the traits as well. So the protein that's affected in Marfan syndrome is found in elastic connective tissue. You have elastic tissue in all kinds of